Experts say young women could prove to be a decisive voting bloc this election, but warn major parties are still struggling to connect with the highly progressive group. New data from ABC Vote Compass shows that more than two-thirds of Gen Z women identify as left-leaning, far in front of their male peers or women of other generations. Vote Compass reporter Isabella Higgins joins us now. Isabella, what does this data tell us?
Well, good morning, Gemma. So the ABC Vote Compass data found that about 67% of women in that Gen Z category identified as politically on the left, and that compared to about 50% of young men in that category and about 52% of women from older generations. So really that younger group of women are way over on the left on that political spectrum. Now, numbers can only tell us so much. So we've been talking to experts trying to unpack this and look at why we see this, and it is a trend that is mirrored around the world and a trend that's been taking place over many, many years. So if we look back to even as recent as the 80s and 90s, women were often considered to be a core part of the conservative voting base, and if we think about that, it's because in decades gone by, women spent a lot more time at home. They were often much more religious. They had less exposure to things like trade unions or other sort of left-wing ideas, but that's absolutely changed in recent decades. We know now that young women are highly educated. They make up a core part of the workforce, but they also really play a large role in a lot of the care industries. If we think of things like nursing, teaching, working in group care homes, and they also still do a lot of the caregiving in their domestic households. So a combination of these factors have really seen women moving to the left in recent decades. It's something that we saw at the US election and very much in Western democracies around the world. We've been chatting to some young women about how they're feeling about this election, if they feel like leaders are talking to them, if the policies represent them, and many of them say that they don't feel well represented by the major parties, that they feel that these major parties don't get young people and how hard it is to grow up at this time. We can take a listen to one young woman I was chatting to, Emma Garvey.
They're trying to appeal to young voters in general through their use of TikTok and stuff and just sort of jumping on trends randomly. But I don't think they're doing a lot with policy-wise to really connect to them. I feel like young people are leaning more Greens than they are, young women are leaning more Greens than they are Labor or Liberals due to their really progressive policies.
Isabella, there's been a trend worldwide of young men drifting to the right. What does this data tell us about what's happening in Australia?
Gemma, it's really interesting because this is something that's been really widely reported. We saw at the US election and some major elections in Europe in recent years as well that young men were drifting to the right or really embracing sort of populist ideology. Now, the Vote Compass data that we have, and this is a population of over 350,000, it shows that young men weren't necessarily moving to the right. In fact, about 50% of them identified as being left-leaning compared to about 33% who identified as being on the political right, and the other portion sitting there in the centre. Now, this mirrors some data that it was available from the 2022 Australian election study. Now, that showed that Gen Z, this age group under 29, were actually more progressive than any other generation gone by in that study's history. So that trend that we've seen around the world perhaps isn't happening in Australia. That's maybe partly to do with compulsory voting that we have here, but also maybe the different kinds of leaders that we have here in Australia. No one really pushing that really strong populist ideology that has been seen in some other places and has been driving this trend. Obviously young men in Australia have access to the internet. The internet manosphere has kind of been thought to be a contributor to this, but from the data that we're seeing from Vote Compass and previous data from Australian elections, it doesn't look like this is a trend that's happening in Australia, though there is some political polarisation between young men and young women, as young women run to the left and young men kind of move a little slower to the left.
And this young voting group as a whole, how important are they for this election?
Well, Gemma, this election, the Australian Electoral Commission has said that Gen Z combined with millennials, so that's Australians under the age of about 45, now outnumber baby boomers. So they were a really large, really important voting bloc, but perhaps they're a little bit more difficult to connect to. They're not necessarily on traditional legacy media. They're much more engaged with social media, other new media platforms like podcasts and YouTube. So this election, we have seen a bit of a change to the campaigning style of our leaders. We've seen both of them going on podcast. In some parts of the media, this has been called the influencer election, particularly as we've seen Labor really embrace trying to talk to some of those young female content creators who have a large audience online. We've seen the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, go on some really popular podcasts, really trying to appeal to that group of young women. So they're a really big part of the electorate, and to not win them over and to not win that younger age group over could mean losing an election.